To actually address your question, we have to get off of that mode of thinking and get back to the point where we say, all right, we are going to be dealing with proper instrumentation. The question is now, which parts are very hard and which ones, given the hard ones, fall into place without even having to worry about it. In fact, they must fall into place. Do you see the difference between saying, all right, we're going to be dealing with some sort of what I'm going to call proper instrumentation for either IIEE or for relationships or both, and that instrumentation can be composed of both very, very hard things with words and numbers and dice and objects and lookup and verbalization of this leads to that, right? They can be very hard in that sense. Or it can be so easy to do, given what is hard, that it falls into place extraordinarily organically just by doing the hard stuff.
Right.
Okay? But that's not the same thing as running it on two separate tracks.
Right.
That's so. Just
everything is soft, and you're not making the things which would benefit by being hard and leaving the things which are obvious from the hard parts.
Right, or perhaps you've hardened everything in the physical combat and left everything else not just soft, but literally run by a different system decided on at the table about how we talk.
Right.
And that is almost such a default standard of role-playing design that there's any number of times I've run into people where they say that is role-playing. That's where you get the whole role versus role shit. Yeah. When you get people saying, well, I want to go on this track, and other people say, well, we want to go on that track. Or this track always overrides that one when necessary, and pick which one. And that's the role versus role thing, and that is garbage. It's just bad design, no matter what manifestation. Let's take IIE as the easier one to work with at the moment. Okay. Let me tell you about a game called Slug. Slug was made available as a one-page insert in copies of Fudge. So when you bought Fudge, a page fell out, and oh, look, it's this game called Slug. The rules for Slug were quite easy. When you do something during play in which you feel you want to roll a die to see how it turns out, pick a die of any size you want, designate any combination of outcomes on it that you think means you succeed, and roll. And that's it. This is the mechanic.
Right.
Now, notice that it is not... it's, in many ways, it's written as a parody. It's written as mockery from the point of view, I think, of saying all that dice rolling and all those mechanics are bullshit anyway, and people, for some reason, fetishize doing them. So why not just make it a fetish and do your fetish if you must? But we know we're going to have to fill everything else in just by talking to each other anyway. So let's just do that, and then whatever freakazoids among you feel the need to pick up a die and roll and abide by it, you just go right ahead, weirdo. Okay. So that's sort of how Slug works. Now, I don't think Slug is very good design, but it does point to a couple of interesting things. First of all, if one were to go in with a slightly different attitude, playing Slug, and say, we're going to pay attention to when a given choice about dice really actually was fun for some reason. We're glad that we rolled instead of didn't roll. And I say we as a group. We like the fact that we rolled at that time. It seemed to do something important for us. More than just, okay, it'll fork here, or some bullshit like Cowboys and Indians. I say yes, you say no. None of that has anything to do with it. We're talking instead by all of us are happier, regardless of what happened, that there was a roll right there and that it proceeded the way that it did. In other words, this degree of probability that we thought of when it was rolled, actually looking back, we're pretty glad about that probability, and we're pretty glad about the way it went. even if it didn't go the way that a character wanted, or we're sad about what happened to a guy because of it, or something like that. But we're glad we did it. Now let's write that down. We're going to keep that one. Yeah. And we're going to keep playing. Now, if you were to play Slug like that and proceed with some goodwill toward the whole process, it would be very interesting to discover that you would hit a hard limit at some point. If you were keeping in mind which situations were important for you for rolling, one set of people, and I'm not talking about preference, I'm talking about play experiences. But let's just take play experiences and keep the people, like, hypothetically the same. Tuesday versus Thursday in two parallel universes, and keep everything else the same. On Tuesday, this group does this, and they find that the dice really speak to them in terms of combat and violent outcomes. And that any kind of social or relationship situation that is equally cathartic / climactic / risky also benefits from those mechanics. And they play along. And so whenever this is what you might think of as sort of the operatic, sort of the stereotypical Forge conflict play, And so whenever we get that going, then we're going to use these dice, and it's working for us. We find that in that context, the results on characters some other feature. I don't want to go relationships right now, but some other feature of play. Perhaps we don't have to roll for degree, for damage, because the die outcome itself, we say, okay, if we hit a maximum value on the die, we're just going to call that a clean kill right there, or something like that. But the point is that you can use the rolls you're using and discover aspects of the IIEE that are easy to fill in because of the things that you're using the mechanics for. And another group flips it around, and they do it totally differently. They find that they really, really like to roll exactly for the extent of the outcome. And then once they've rolled for the extent of the outcome, then they actually found it pretty easy to decide, for example, who went first. They kind of reverse the order a little bit.
Right.
So, in some way. But so they come up with a slightly different way of what they're rolling for and how that relates to the order in which people went than the Tuesday group. When the hyperdimensional, comparison case does it on Thursday, they end up with a different profile of what got represented by the dice and the numbers. But each one successfully constructed some kind of IIEE procedure so that each one ends up having wonderful outcomes for fights and arguments. So that's the trouble. I cannot say to you, I'm going to open the IIE cabinet, and I'm going to tell you, well, we want to have a successful IIEE here, so therefore we have to roll for this I, and then we have to pick from a table for the next I, and then the next one we have to, ask the person to the left, and then finally the last one we have to roll on another table. I can't really give you a recipe for someone who says, Ron, I'd really like to have dramatic arguments like they used to have, in Marvel Comics, when one person is ordering a cup of coffee and another person's asking if he could see the newspaper, but the way it's drawn, it looks like it's opera. Everybody's wrenching at their shirts and sweating and, all intense. I want to have those. I want to have these conversations that are these incredible clashing outcomes of priorities.
Right.
And so what should I do for IIE? What's the right mechanic? See the problem? There isn't a right mechanic.
Yeah.
There is only it's one of those things where if you put your finger on one mechanic that you really want in there, then a whole bunch of other ones will fall out as being hard necessary to set it up or to flow from it, or as unnecessary to be hard, because if you're going to do that, then bringing in this other aspect of IIEE is real easy without a number for it. And so the same thing happens with relationship mechanics, which can run all the way from not even anything on the sheet about relationships, not even anywhere about relationships. They're not even written down or anything.
Right.
But through the course of play, we find people have these intense relationships with other characters. And we also find that those relationships develop, change, and are emotionally, relevant to other things they do. I don't think it's too hard to understand that if you put in even the barest touch of such a thing, like a list, a place to write down friends and lovers,
right,
or friends and lovers and enemies, just a place to write them down,
right,
that will go a long way toward having relationships be valued in the game at all. The sheet isn't really saying you have to do this. And I'm not talking about breadcrumbs, every time you say the lover's name during play, you get an experience point or something like that. I'm not talking about that either. I'm talking right now about how it is possible to get somewhere with a relationship in play just by having it mentioned that you can.
Right.
Now, if you then say, okay, so what am I going to do with combat or other violent, complicated, or complicated, high effort, high risk activities? And what am I going to do with relationships? So that a mechanic that I choose to harden up about it is a really, really good anchor for everybody. It doesn't mean everything about relationships is now codified. I mean, you can go to Lace and Steel or Albedo, both by Paul Kidd for that stuff, where relationships, and which they call ties and antipathies, are so complex and related to the variable called self-image. And then those are checked relative to the two aspects of the character's disposition, more or less the external and the internal one, a lot like the vampire mechanics, in fact, where you have like two dispositions, one is external, one is internal.
Yeah.
You have those in Albedo and Lace and Steel. You also have self-image, which is another score. And then you also have listed ties and antipathies, all with scores of their own. And I should let you know that Albedo is a very, very dice-heavy, very resolution-heavy system. Both of those games are. And that you are rolling for different angles on all of these things all the time. And the numbers are making the other numbers bounce up and down all the time. So it's really, really engineered in terms of relationship mechanics.